Welcome back to WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey through the lives of those who shaped our world. Dear learners, today we'll step into the life of a man whose energy could shake the walls of history itself, Theodore Roosevelt. The fearless, Rough Rider, president who turned weakness into strength, and bold ideas into national reform. This is not just a story about power or politics. It's about how one man refused to be defeated by life, from a sick, fragile child to a leader whose voice thundered with confidence and courage. Theodore Roosevelt believed that living fully meant daring greatly, no matter the cost. Through this story, you'll not only improve your English, but you'll also discover the heart of a man who lived every moment with passion, and who showed the world that courage can be built, one challenge at a time. If you'd like to support our work, you're welcome to like, comment, share, or join us. Your support means a lot and helps us keep creating meaningful stories like this one. So, are you ready to meet the unstoppable force who carried America into a new century, and charged straight into history? Let's begin the journey into the bold and unbreakable life of Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt was born on October 27, 1858, in a brownstone house on East 20th Street, New York City, into a world of privilege and comfort. His father, Theodore Roosevelt Sr., was a wealthy businessman known for his generosity and deep sense of civic duty. His mother, Martha "Mittie" Bullock Roosevelt, came from an old Southern family of Georgia, with charm and grace that gave young Theodore a warm but complex childhood home. The Roosevelts were a blend of Northern discipline and Southern gentility, a combination that would later shape the young boy's dual nature, tender-hearted yet fiercely determined. But outside the elegant home, America itself was at a crossroads. The nation was divided by the Civil War, and the air was thick with tension, change, and moral struggle. Theodore's father, a man of conscience, supported the Union and worked to aid soldiers and the poor, teaching his son that strength and compassion must always walk together. Meanwhile, the country was beginning to transform, from a land of farmers to a rising industrial power. Smoke, progress, and ambition filled the cities. It was an age of invention, opportunity, and growing inequality. Inside this storm of change, young Theodore was born into comfort, yet his body was his greatest enemy. He suffered from severe asthma, gasping for breath through many sleepless nights. His lungs often failed him, leaving him weak, pale, and isolated from other children. The world outside seemed too rough for a boy so frail. But inside him, something else stirred, a spark that would one day become a blazing fire. His father, seeing his son's suffering, gave him advice that would define his life. "Theodore, you have the mind, but you haven't the body. You must make your body." These words struck deeply. They became a challenge, a sacred mission. In that era, when America demanded strong men to shape its destiny, Theodore Roosevelt began his own private battle, not against nations or rivals, but against himself. His early world was one of contrasts: wealth and illness, privilege and pain, a loving home within a restless, changing country. He would later say, "I never would have been president if it had not been for my asthma." The boy who could barely breathe would one day lead a nation with breathless energy. As we step into his youth, a question arises for all of us. What would you do if the thing meant to break you became the very reason you grew stronger? Theodore Roosevelt's early years were marked by pain, isolation, and fierce determination. The wheezing attacks of asthma left him weak and dependent, and doctors of the time had few solutions. Many nights, his father would carry him through the dark streets of New York in a horse-drawn carriage, hoping the cold night air would ease his son's breathing. For most boys, this illness might have meant a quiet life, sheltered from the roughness of the world. But for Theodore, every breathless night planted a deeper will to live, fully, fearlessly, and without excuse. He spent long hours indoors, reading books about nature, animals, and heroes. The great explorers and warriors of history filled his imagination, men who dared to face danger, who acted rather than waited. He studied the lives of knights, hunters, and leaders, and slowly, he began to dream of becoming one himself. Still, dreams alone were not enough. His thin frame and fragile body stood in painful contrast to the vigorous life he imagined. He longed to ride horses, climb mountains, and explore wild lands, but his lungs betrayed him at every turn. When he was around 12, a turning point came. One day, after another exhausting asthma attack, his father looked him straight in the eye and said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but not the body. Without the body, the mind cannot go as far as it should. You must make your body." It was not just advice, it was a challenge, spoken with love and belief. From that day, young Theodore made a vow. He would not surrender to weakness. He began a program of strenuous life, a term he would later make famous. At first, he struggled through simple exercises, push-ups, running, lifting weights, but with time, the boy who once gasped for air grew stronger. His father built a small gym on the family's rooftop so that Theodore could train every day. Sweat replaced fear, and muscles replaced fragility. Each victory, no matter how small, filled him with pride. He learned to box, to ride, to hike, to hunt, and in doing so, he transformed his illness into a source of discipline. Yet the battle was not only against his body. He also faced ridicule from others, who saw him as strange, a rich boy obsessed with toughness and adventure. But Theodore didn't care. His fight was private and sacred. It wasn't about impressing others. It was about conquering himself. Outside his personal world, America too was beginning to change. Industry was booming, cities were growing, and social divides were widening. Corruption crept through politics. The young Roosevelt, sensitive to injustice, began to see that strength was not only physical, it was moral. It meant standing up for what was right, even when it was unpopular. By his teenage years, he was no longer just a boy who trained his body, he was a thinker, a writer, and a budding reformer. He began to understand that character, not comfort, was the real measure of greatness. The seeds of leadership had been planted. And yet, the greatest tests were still ahead, for life would soon strip away the comfort of youth and force him to face grief, loss, and the brutal realities of adulthood. But in those fragile beginnings, Roosevelt had already discovered his life's law: do what you can, with what you have, where you are. Would you have had the courage to rebuild yourself from weakness, if life had told you that you couldn't? Theodore Roosevelt entered Harvard University in 1876, at the age of 18. By then, the weak, gasping boy of his childhood had become a lean, determined young man. But beneath his newfound strength lay a restless spirit, eager to prove himself, yet unsure where that drive would lead. Harvard was a world of privilege and intellect, and Theodore, with his sharp mind and fiery enthusiasm, quickly made his mark. He was curious about everything: history, science, nature, philosophy, and he never did anything halfway. Yet, while others at Harvard enjoyed the comfort of their social circles, Theodore was still fighting an invisible war, not against asthma this time, but against the fear of being ordinary. He studied late into the night, pushed his body through boxing matches and long walks, and even began to write his first book, The Naval War of 1812. It was an ambitious project for a student, but Roosevelt believed knowledge should serve a purpose, to prepare the mind for action. Still, behind all his ambition was a boy searching for meaning. He wanted to live a life of purpose, not ease. His father had always been his guiding light, a man of honor who combined strength with compassion. So when Theodore's father died suddenly in 1878, the shock shattered him. He was just 19. The man who had told him to make his body was gone, leaving behind a void that no exercise or study could fill. The loss cut deeply, but it also hardened his resolve. "I will live my life as he would have wanted me to," he vowed. That promise became the invisible hand steering every choice he would make thereafter. After graduating from Harvard, Roosevelt entered politics, a world his wealthy background didn't require him to enter, but his conscience demanded it. At a time when corruption was common and powerful men used government for profit, the young Roosevelt stood out for his honesty and idealism. He became a member of the New York State Assembly at only 23, earning both admiration and enemies for his bold, reformist spirit. He fought against political machines, challenged the misuse of power, and refused to be silenced. But in those early years, life tested him again in ways far harsher than politics. He fell deeply in love with Alice Hathaway Lee, a woman whose grace and beauty captured his heart completely. Their marriage in 1880 brought him a rare sense of peace and happiness, the kind he had rarely known since his father's death. Together, they built dreams of a bright future. Yet fate can be cruel to even the strongest spirits. Just 4 years later, in February 1884, everything collapsed. On Valentine's Day, Roosevelt's beloved wife Alice died giving birth to their first child, and on that same day, in the same house, his mother also passed away from illness. 2 deaths within hours, 2 women he loved most, gone without warning. In his diary, Roosevelt wrote a single, heartbreaking line, "The light has gone out of my life." The once vibrant man was consumed by grief. The energy that had driven him for years turned to ashes. Friends worried that he would never recover. But in pain, Roosevelt did what he had always done, he moved forward. When his world collapsed, he sought refuge not in comfort, but in challenge. He left New York, leaving behind politics, fame, and grief. He traveled west to the Dakota Territory, a wild, untamed land of storms, cattle, and silence. There, on the open plains and under the vast skies, he began to rebuild himself once again, not as a politician, not as a scholar, but as a man of the frontier. The next chapter of his life would shape him into something greater, a man whose courage was no longer just personal, but national. Have you ever faced a loss so great that it forced you to start over from nothing, and find strength you never knew you had? The Dakota Territory in the mid-1880s was nothing like New York. It was a place of raw, untamed wilderness, where the wind could cut like a blade and the silence could swallow a man whole. When Theodore Roosevelt arrived, the city politician was out of place among the rugged cowboys and settlers. Yet that was exactly why he came. He had lost everything he loved, and the world that once made sense no longer held meaning. The frontier, in all its brutal honesty, was his chance to begin again. He built a small ranch along the Little Missouri River and called it Elkhorn. The landscape was harsh, but magnificent: open skies, wild buffalo, icy winters, and a beauty so lonely it forced a man to listen to his own soul. Roosevelt threw himself into this life with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He rode horses across endless plains, branded cattle, chased outlaws, and hunted in the frozen wilderness. He faced blizzards, starvation, and the constant threat of failure. But something powerful was happening. In the struggle to survive, his grief began to transform. The land tested him, stripped him of comfort, and gave him clarity. He once said, "Black care rarely sits behind a rider whose pace is fast enough." The more he pushed himself, the less room there was for sorrow. Out here, every breath mattered. Every sunrise was earned. The Dakotas became his second education, one not found in books, but in hardship. He learned resilience, humility, and the quiet dignity of endurance. Local ranchers began to respect him. They called him Old Four Eyes because of his glasses, but also the real thing because he worked as hard as any of them. For the first time, Roosevelt wasn't living for approval or ambition. He was living to become whole. Then came a test that would reveal the steel inside him. One winter, 3 outlaws stole his boat and fled down the icy Little Missouri River. Most men would have accepted the loss, but not Roosevelt. He and 2 ranch hands built another boat and went after them, rowing for days through freezing winds and danger. When they finally caught up with the thieves, Roosevelt arrested them himself and personally escorted them over 300 miles through the wilderness to justice. It was a reckless act, but it defined who he was. Strength, courage, and duty, all in one moment. When he returned from the frontier, Roosevelt was no longer a man escaping pain. He was reborn. The grief that once crushed him had become fuel. The harsh land had given him what no city could: peace in the face of chaos, calm in the face of loss. He returned to New York transformed, carrying with him the spirit of the West, its independence, honesty, and sense of justice. He re-entered politics, not as a broken man, but as a force of nature. In 1889, he became the U.S. Civil Service Commissioner, taking on corruption with unshakable courage. His fierce energy and moral integrity made him both admired and feared. From that point on, Roosevelt's life became a steady climb toward greatness, from reforming New York's police department, to becoming Assistant Secretary of the Navy, to organizing the legendary Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. The man who once fought for breath was now leading men into battle. That war, and the courage he showed in it, would soon change his destiny forever. But it all began here, in the cold winds of Dakota, where a grieving heart was remade into the heart of a leader. Sometimes, life must break us before it can build us. And for Theodore Roosevelt, the wilderness was not his escape, it was his rebirth. As he once reflected years later, it is hard to fail, but it is worse never to have tried to succeed. Would you have followed the river of grief until it turned into strength, as he did, chasing not revenge, but redemption? By the end of the 1890s, Theodore Roosevelt's name had begun to echo across America, a man of action, conviction, and restless energy. The boy who once gasped for air now seemed unstoppable. Yet every rise to greatness carries its moment of ultimate testing, when ideals collide with the brutal weight of reality. For Roosevelt, that moment came not in comfort, but in war. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. The conflict began in Cuba, where Spanish rule had long been harsh and violent. When the U.S. battleship Maine mysteriously exploded in Havana Harbor, outrage spread through the nation. War fever gripped America, and Roosevelt, then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, felt it stir every part of his being. He saw war not as a chance for glory, but as a test of courage, of manhood, of duty. Against the advice of many, he resigned from his comfortable government position and volunteered for service. He helped form the first U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, a wild, diverse band of men later known as the Rough Riders. Cowboys, miners, scholars, and athletes, men from every walk of life united under one banner of courage. And at their head rode Roosevelt, charging into battle with his glasses shining and his spirit burning. Cuba was a furnace of heat, disease, and chaos. The Rough Riders fought through jungles and hills, facing exhaustion, hunger, and deadly enemy fire. But Roosevelt's energy was contagious. He pushed his men forward, always leading from the front. He didn't order others to charge, he charged himself. On July 1, 1898, at the Battle of San Juan Hill, he mounted his horse and led a daring assault that broke through enemy lines. Bullets tore through the air, soldiers fell, but Roosevelt never slowed. That charge, fierce, reckless, and triumphant, became one of the most famous moments in American military history. When the battle ended, Roosevelt walked among the wounded, his uniform torn, his glasses cracked, his heart heavy but proud. The victory came at a price, lives lost, innocence shattered. Yet in that crucible, Roosevelt's destiny crystallized. The courage he had built since childhood, the courage to fight through pain, loss, and fear, had now become visible to the world. He had faced death and found within himself not just bravery, but purpose. When he returned home, the nation hailed him as a hero. Newspapers called him the hero of San Juan Hill. But Roosevelt saw something deeper in that moment. He realized that the true battle was not fought in Cuba, it was the battle for America's soul. The country was changing rapidly, factories filled cities, corruption spread through government, and greed consumed the dreams of ordinary people. The next fight would not be against a foreign enemy, but against injustice at home. In 1899, Roosevelt was elected governor of New York. There, he began to challenge the powerful political machines that controlled the state. He fought for cleaner government, fair labor laws, and the regulation of corporations that exploited workers and the environment. Many political bosses hated him. They called him stubborn, reckless, uncontrollable. But Roosevelt had already faced tougher opponents than men with money. He had faced death, grief, and the wilderness, and survived. When political enemies tried to sideline him by nominating him for the vice presidency under William McKinley in 1900, they thought they were sending him into a powerless position. Instead, fate had other plans. In 1901, after President McKinley was assassinated, Theodore Roosevelt, at only 42 years old, became the youngest president in American history. The boy who once fought for breath was now breathing life into a nation. Yet standing at the height of power, Roosevelt knew the cost of such a climb, every triumph built upon pain, every victory shadowed by sacrifice. He had made his choice long ago, to live not for comfort, but for meaning. As he took the oath of office, his eyes were steady, his voice strong. The Rough Rider had ridden not just up San Juan Hill, but into the heart of history itself. The true test of his presidency, and his legacy, was only beginning. Would you have had the courage to risk comfort, safety, and reputation, all for the sake of your ideals? When Theodore Roosevelt entered the White House in 1901, he brought with him not the calm of a career politician, but the fire of a reformer. At just 42, he was the youngest man ever to become President of the United States. Yet his youth was not a weakness, it was an engine. He believed that leadership meant movement, energy, and moral courage. America, standing on the edge of a new century, needed all three. His presidency was guided by one simple belief: the government must serve the people, not the powerful. Roosevelt looked around and saw a nation divided, monopolies crushing small businesses, dangerous working conditions, and vast natural lands being destroyed for profit. He decided to act, no matter the resistance. He challenged the great industrial trusts, massive corporations that controlled entire industries. Many feared them, Roosevelt confronted them. He became known as a trust buster, breaking up monopolies and proving that even the mightiest were not above the law. No man is above the law, and no man is below it, he declared. Nor do we ask any man's permission when we require him to obey it. His courage to stand against greed restored faith in fairness, and in the power of justice. But Roosevelt's vision went beyond economics. He cared deeply about the American people, especially the weak, the workers, and the voiceless. His Square Deal promised fairness for all citizens, whether rich or poor. He pushed for safer workplaces, food regulations, and protections against corporate abuse. His leadership gave the ordinary American something they had long been denied: a sense of dignity and hope. Roosevelt also had a fierce love for nature. He believed that progress meant nothing if it destroyed the beauty of the land that gave life to the nation. During his presidency, he created national parks, wildlife refuges, and forest preserves, protecting over 230 million acres of land. The nation behaves well, he said, if it treats the natural resources as assets which it must turn over to the next generation increased, and not impaired, in value. Those words became the foundation of the American conservation movement. His foreign policy, too, was built on boldness balanced with wisdom. Roosevelt's motto, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," reflected his belief in peace through strength. He modernized the U.S. Navy, expanded America's influence abroad, and brokered peace between Russia and Japan, an act that won him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. No American president before him had received such an honor. Everywhere he went, Roosevelt's boundless energy inspired others. He invited African American leader Booker T. Washington to the White House, challenging racial norms of his time. He spoke passionately about moral courage, civic duty, and the need for citizens to live the strenuous life, a philosophy of effort, endurance, and service. His years in office were a whirlwind of reform, progress, and vision. Yet through it all, Roosevelt never lost his sense of wonder or humility. He would often disappear into the wild, hunting, hiking, or exploring, reminding himself that the world was larger than politics, and that a man must stay close to nature to stay close to truth. By the end of his presidency in 1909, Roosevelt had reshaped the American spirit. He had proven that leadership was not about privilege, but purpose, not about ruling, but serving. The boy who had once struggled to breathe had now given his country a breath of renewal. As he left office, the crowds cheered not just a man, but a movement, the belief that courage and integrity could still guide the world's most powerful nation. He once said, "Far better it is to dare mighty things, to win glorious triumphs, even though checkered by failure, than to rank with those timid souls who neither enjoy much nor suffer much." Roosevelt had dared, and in daring, he had changed America forever. When Theodore Roosevelt left the presidency, he was not leaving power, he was leaving an imprint on the very heart of America. Few men had lived with such intensity, such conviction that every day must be used for something larger than oneself. His legacy was not merely written in laws or monuments, but in the character he inspired in others. He showed that true strength begins not in muscles, but in the will, the determination to face what seems impossible and to keep moving forward. From a sick child gasping for air to a president riding at the front of history, Roosevelt embodied the triumph of human spirit over circumstance. His entire life had been a declaration that courage is a choice, and that every choice shapes the world we live in. Even after leaving office, he continued to explore, to write, to serve. In 1909, he set out on a year-long African safari, documenting wildlife and advocating for conservation. Later, he explored the deadly river of doubt in the Amazon, surviving malaria, infection, and starvation, once again proving that his greatest victories were those against fear and limitation. Roosevelt's influence reached far beyond his lifetime. His ideas about fairness, conservation, and moral duty became pillars of modern American leadership. He believed that citizenship meant participation, that democracy could only live when ordinary people cared enough to act. "Do what you can, with what you have, where you are," he said, a lesson that still echoes in classrooms, workplaces, and hearts around the world. His spirit continues to challenge us today, to be bold in the face of doubt, to act when others stay silent, to rise again when life knocks us down. He proved that greatness is not a gift but a daily decision, to live with purpose, to serve with honor, and to never, ever quit. As the sun set on his life in 1919, the world mourned not just a former president, but a symbol of what it means to live fully. He had once said, "Keep your eyes on the stars, and your feet on the ground." And that is exactly what he did, balancing vision with action, power with humility, and faith with effort. So perhaps the greatest lesson Theodore Roosevelt left us is this: you do not need a perfect beginning to create a powerful ending. You only need courage, the courage to begin. Now, as you reflect on his journey, ask yourself, what is the strenuous life you are called to live, and are you brave enough to answer it? Dear learners, you've just journeyed through the extraordinary life of Theodore Roosevelt, a man who refused to let weakness define him, who turned pain into power, and who taught the world that greatness is built, not born. His story is not just about one president's rise, but about the strength hidden inside every human being, including you. Roosevelt once said, "It is not the critic who counts. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena." Those words remind us that courage is not found in watching life happen, but in daring to take part in it, even when failure is possible, even when fear is near. So, as you continue your own learning and your own journey, remember the lessons of the Rough Rider president: face your fears. Do your duty. Protect what is right. and live each day with boldness and purpose. English learning, like Roosevelt's life, is not about perfection, it's about persistence and the joy of growth through challenge. Share his story, carry his message, and let it inspire you to step boldly into your own arena, whether that means speaking up, starting something new, or simply refusing to give up when life grows hard. If this story touched you, you can support our work by liking, commenting, sharing, or subscribing. Every gesture helps us bring more stories of courage, leadership, and hope to learners around the world. Until next time, keep learning, keep daring, and keep believing in your own power to change the world. One word, one lesson, one act of courage at a time. This is WSE English Story, where learning English becomes a journey through the hearts of heroes. Goodbye for now.